Picture a world where the very ground beneath an army's feet could mean the difference between victory and total defeat. For centuries, battles were fought with swords and shields, but the true masterminds of the 100 Years' War knew something even more powerful lay hidden in the landscape itself. This wasn't just a clash of men and steel. It was a war where rivers whispered secrets, forests became fortresses, and hillsides turned into traps. Commanders didn't just fight their enemies, they fought with the land, bending its contours to their will in ways so clever, so audacious, that they rewrote the rules of medieval warfare. Think about the sheer brilliance it took to see a muddy field not as an obstacle but as a weapon, to lure an enemy into a valley where the terrain did the killing for you. The 100 Years' War wasn't just a series of battles. It was a chess game played across mountains and marshes, where every twist in the road could hide an ambush, every cliff edge a deadly advantage. These weren't just soldiers, they were artists of strategy, painting their victories with the brushstrokes of geography. And the most astonishing part, many of these tactics were so effective, they're still studied by military minds today. So how did they do it? How did commanders transform ordinary landscapes into engines of war? That's the story we're about to unravel. From the fog-shrouded forests where entire armies vanished to the riverbanks that became natural kill zones, we'll count down the 25 most ingenious uses of terrain in this epic conflict. Each one is a testament to human creativity under pressure, a reminder that sometimes the greatest weapon isn't forged in fire, it's shaped by the earth itself. This is the untold story of how the land fought back and how the cleverest warriors let it lead them to glory. The 100 Years' War wasn't just a single conflict, it was a sprawling drama that unfolded over more than a century, reshaping the very nature of medieval warfare. At its heart lay a bitter dispute between two royal houses, England's Plantagenets, who claimed the French throne through ancestry, and France's Valois dynasty, determined to keep their kingdom intact. But this wasn't merely a clash of kings. The war stretched across generations, its battlefields shifting with the seasons as commanders adapted to new technologies, tactics, and crucially, the landscapes where they fought. Imagine a time when castles dominated the horizon, their stone walls seemingly invincible, until someone realized rivers could be diverted to undermine their foundations. Picture armies marching through dense forests, not realizing those towering trees could become an enemy's greatest ally. This was an era where understanding the land meant survival, where a commander who could read the terrain like a map held the key to victory. The war saw the rise of the English longbow, the stubborn persistence of armored knights, and the terrifying introduction of gunpowder, but none of these innovations mattered half as much as the ground beneath the soldiers' feet. What made this conflict truly revolutionary was how both sides learned to weaponize nature itself. French commanders turned their country's network of rivers into defensive barriers, while English forces used the rolling hills of Normandy to stage devastating ambushes. Marshlands that appeared impassable became strategic strongholds, and open fields that seemed perfect for cavalry charges concealed deadly traps. Even the weather played its part. Fog could mask an army's movements, while rain turned the earth into a weapon, bogging down heavily armored troops. The political turmoil of the time forced commanders to think creatively, with supply lines stretching across hostile territory and loyalties shifting like the wind. Controlling the landscape often meant controlling the war. Castles weren't just fortresses, they were chess pieces positioned to dominate river crossings, mountain passes, and trade routes. A single well-placed garrison could dictate the movement of entire armies. And as the war dragged on, both sides became masters of turning their surroundings against the enemy, proving that in warfare, sometimes the land itself chooses the winner. In medieval warfare, terrain wasn't just background scenery, it was the ultimate tactical tool. Without modern reconnaissance, commanders relied on intimate knowledge of the land to outmaneuver their enemies. A single river could force an army to march days out of its way, burning precious supplies and morale. Dense forests weren't just obstacles, they were shields for ambushes where a handful of archers could decimate columns of armored knights. Even something as simple as a sloping hill could decide a battle, giving archers longer range or forcing cavalry to charge uphill into a wall of spears. Take the English Longbowmen, for instance. These legendary fighters didn't just rely on their deadly arrows, they needed the right ground to maximize their advantage. Positioning themselves on high ground meant their volleys flew farther and struck harder, while marshland or thick mud could bog down enemy knights, turning them into easy targets. The French learned this the hard way at battles like Crécy, where the terrain amplified the longbow's lethality. But it wasn't just about elevation. Commanders studied every detail: the firmness of the soil for cavalry charges, the width of valleys for flanking maneuvers, even the direction of the wind to avoid blowing smoke into their own troops' faces. Supply lines were another terrain-dependent puzzle. Armies couldn't march far without reliable access to water, forage, or defensible routes. A castle built near a river crossing didn't just guard the bridge, it controlled the entire region's movement. Cut off an enemy's supply route by seizing a strategic pass, and their army might starve before a single sword was drawn. The 100 Years' War saw both sides mastering this chess game, using rivers, forests, and even seasonal floods to strangle opponents into submission. Morale, too, was tied to the land. Soldiers fighting on familiar ground fought harder, while invaders struggled with exhaustion and disorientation. A clever commander could use the terrain to create illusions, luring enemies into narrow defiles where their numbers meant nothing, or feigning retreat over ground that concealed reinforcements. The land itself became a psychological weapon, playing tricks on the weary and unprepared. Now, let's dive into the first of these masterstrokes: how the English turned an unassuming patch of marshland into a death trap at the Battle of Agincourt. What looked like a soggy inconvenience became the perfect arena for one of history's most lopsided victories. The fields around Crécy seemed harmless enough at first glance, just another stretch of countryside where two armies might meet. But King Edward III of England saw something his French counterparts missed: a slight rise in the land, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, flanked by patches of marshy ground still soggy from recent rains. This unremarkable slope would become the stage for one of the most devastating demonstrations of terrain warfare in medieval history. As the French knights advanced in their gleaming armor, confident in their overwhelming numbers, they assumed the wet earth would be nothing more than a minor inconvenience. What they didn't realize was that Edward had deliberately anchored his lines with those marshes on either flank, funneling the charging cavalry into a killing zone. The Longbowmen, positioned on that gentle incline, suddenly had perfect sightlines, their arrows arcing down into a mass of horses and men struggling through the muck. The mud did more than slow the French advance, it shattered their formation. War horses bred for speed and power sank to their knees, their riders toppling into the sludge where they became easy prey for English infantry. Knights who'd trained their whole lives for open field combat found themselves immobilized, their heavy armor now a death sentence in the clinging wet earth. Meanwhile, Edward's archers, standing firm on dry ground, could reload and loose volley after volley without interruption. What made Crécy so revolutionary wasn't just the English victory, it was how thoroughly the terrain dictated the battle's outcome. Edward didn't just use the land, he weaponized its every feature. The slope gave his arrows extra range, the marshes corralled the enemy into a narrow front, and even the evening sun, positioned behind the English lines, blinded the French as they struggled forward. This wasn't brute force triumphing, it was a masterclass in letting the landscape do the fighting. The aftermath left the French nobility in shock. Their traditional tactics, built around glorious cavalry charges, had been humiliated by a patch of wet ground and a few thousand yeomen with longbows. Crécy proved that in this new era of warfare, the real general wasn't just the commander, it was the terrain itself. And as the 100 Years' War stretched on, both sides would take this lesson to heart, turning every hill, forest, and river into a potential ally or deadly foe. Next came an even bolder manipulation of nature's defenses, one that didn't just use existing terrain but actively reshaped it. At the Siege of Calais, the English would show how earthworks could become walls and how patience could outlast stone. The dense forests near Poitiers should have been a warning, nature's own fortress, with gnarled roots and low branches conspiring against any army foolish enough to charge blindly through. But when the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, retreated his outnumbered English forces into those shadowed woods in 1356, the French saw only prey fleeing to cover. What they didn't realize was that the trees themselves had been drafted into the English ranks. This wasn't just a retreat, it was a trap meticulously set. The English had scouted the forest's narrow game trails, knowing the dense undergrowth would splinter the French cavalry's greatest strength, their thunderous, unified charges. As the French knights urged their war horses forward, the forest fought back. Low branches ripped at visors, roots tripped armored destriers, and the tight confines forced horsemen into single file, their formation collapsing into chaos. Suddenly, the flower of French chivalry found themselves tangled in a living net, their lances useless in the close quarters, while English longbowmen picked them off from behind natural barricades of fallen logs. The Black Prince's genius lay in understanding that terrain could rewrite the rules of engagement. Where the French expected open combat, he gave them a labyrinth. Every twisted oak became an ally, every thicket a shield. His archers, positioned on slightly elevated clearings, had clear shots at knights struggling through the underbrush, while the French couldn't even raise their swords without catching them on branches. The forest didn't just neutralize their numbers, it turned their armor against them, as the heat and weight of their plate mail exhausted men already fighting the terrain itself. What made Poitiers extraordinary wasn't just the victory, but how thoroughly the English exploited every natural advantage. They'd even chosen ground where the morning sun would slant through the trees, dazzling French eyes while illuminating their own targets. By the time the French realized they'd been herded into a slaughterhouse, it was too late. Their retreat routes were blocked by their own fallen comrades and the very thickets they dismissed as irrelevant. This battle proved that in the right hands, even passive features like trees and thorns could become active weapons. The lesson reverberated across Europe. From now on, no commander could afford to see terrain as mere scenery. It was a living, breathing participant in every battle, one that could strangle an army without ever drawing a sword. And as the war dragged on, both sides would find even more brutal ways to make the land itself take sides. By the time Henry V's exhausted English army reached Agincourt in October 1415, the land itself seemed to conspire against them. Weeks of relentless autumn rains had transformed the open fields between two dense forests into a churning sea of mud, what medieval chroniclers called new-turned earth, so soft that men sank into it to their knees. What appeared to be a disaster for the outnumbered English became their secret weapon, proving once again that in warfare, the cleverest commanders don't fight against the terrain, they make it fight for them. The genius of Henry's positioning lay in forcing the French to attack across this sodden killing field. While his lightly armored longbowmen could move freely near the tree lines, the French knights encased in 60 pounds of plate armor found themselves sinking like stones. Contemporary accounts describe men at arms drowning face down in puddles, their own weight pressing them into the muck as they struggled to rise. The very prestige that made French nobility formidable, their extravagant armor, became their undoing as the glutinous earth transformed their glorious charge into a slow-motion nightmare. Henry didn't just rely on the mud's natural obstacles. He engineered his entire battle array to maximize its effects. By narrowing the front between the two woods, he compressed the French advance into a human traffic jam where rear ranks pushed forward blindly, trampling their own vanguard into the mud. English archers, positioned on slightly firmer ground at the flanks, rained arrows into this struggling mass with murderous efficiency. The wet soil also neutralized the French crossbowmen, their expensive, delicate weapons rendered useless by damp bowstrings while English longbows kept firing through the rain. What made Agincourt extraordinary wasn't just the English victory against overwhelming odds, but how completely the terrain dictated the battle's rhythm. The mud slowed French movements to a crawl, allowing Henry's lightly equipped men to dance around their bogged-down opponents. When the English finally counterattacked, they did so across ground they'd chosen firm enough for mobility, but churned up just enough to exhaust their enemies. Even the forests played their part, preventing French cavalry from flanking and reflecting the terrifying sound of thousands of arrows back onto the trapped knights. This battle demonstrated a brutal truth of medieval warfare. Nature showed no loyalty to crowns or banners. The same rain that nourished crops could drown an army in its own armor, and a king's brilliant tactics meant nothing if he failed to read the ground beneath his feet. Agincourt's legacy endures not just as a military triumph, but as a stark lesson in how humility before the land could mean the difference between legend and obliteration. Yet the war's most cunning terrain trick still lay ahead, one that didn't just use existing landscapes, but actively sculpted them into weapons. At the Siege of Rouen, defenders would discover how earth itself could become as formidable as any stone wall. By the summer of 1424, the English position in France hung by a thread until a single hill near Verneuil became their unlikely savior. The Duke of Bedford didn't just occupy that rise in the land, he transformed it into a fortress of earth and stakes, turning gravity itself into an ally. What looked like a modest elevation became a killing ground where physics fought for England. The French commanders, confident in their superior numbers, assumed the slope would barely slow their advance. They didn't grasp how thoroughly the English had weaponized every inch of that incline. Bedford's men spent hours sharpening stakes and digging shallow trenches, not to stop the charge but to disrupt it. As the French cavalry labored upward, their horses' momentum faltered, their formation fracturing under the strain. Meanwhile, English longbowmen, positioned just below the crest, enjoyed an unobstructed view of the struggling mass below. Their arrows flew with terrifying precision, each volley gaining extra force from the downward angle. Elevation did more than improve visibility, it dictated the battle's rhythm. The slope forced the French to abandon their carefully rehearsed formations, compressing their advance into a disorganized scramble. Knights who reached the summit, exhausted, found themselves facing fresh English men at arms, while their own reinforcements struggled to join the fray. Even the sun played its part, blinding upward-gazing attackers while silhouetting defenders against the sky. But the true brilliance lay in how Bedford exploited the hill's psychological impact. Watching comrades falter on the incline shattered French morale long before blades clashed. The higher ground didn't just offer tactical advantage, it whispered doubt into every attacker's mind. By nightfall, what began as a French show of strength became a rout, proving once again that in medieval warfare, the sharpest weapon wasn't steel, it was perspective. This victory revealed an uncomfortable truth for commanders. In battle, altitude equaled authority. The army holding the heights didn't just shoot farther or charge harder, it controlled the narrative of the fight itself. And as the war dragged on, both sides would learn that sometimes the difference between triumph and disaster was a matter of meters. The rolling countryside near Pate seemed like perfect longbow country, open fields where English archers could unleash their deadly volleys with impunity. But in June 1429, the French turned the landscape itself into a surprise ally, proving that even the humblest features could rewrite the rules of war. Those dense hedgerows dividing farmland weren't just property markers, they became nature's own fortifications, shielding Joan of Arc's cavalry from arrows until the decisive moment. What made Pate so revolutionary was how the French flipped traditional battlefield logic. Instead of avoiding obstacles, they embraced them, using the hedges as screening devices to mask their movements. English commanders, accustomed to clear lines of sight for their archers, suddenly found their killing zones fragmented by these living walls. The hedges forced the Longbowmen to reposition constantly, breaking their rhythm, while French knights navigated hidden pathways known only to locals. By the time the English realized the trap, armored horsemen were already bursting through gaps in the foliage close enough that arrows couldn't stop them. The real genius lay in timing. The French didn't just hide behind hedges, they used them to control the battle's tempo. Advanced scouts monitored English formations from concealment, waiting for the exact moment when archers were most vulnerable, typically while repositioning or reloading. Then, like a coiled spring released, cavalry erupted from multiple points simultaneously, compressing what should have been a long-range engagement into a brutal melee where swords and lances ruled. Pate shattered the myth of longbow invincibility not through brute force but through terrain literacy. Those hedgerows, often dismissed as mere agricultural features, became force multipliers, scattering arrows, disrupting sightlines, and funneling attackers into kill zones. Even the height of the hedges played a role, tall enough to obscure movement, yet low enough to vault over when the charge began. It was terrain warfare at its most subtle, proving that sometimes victory grew as naturally as the bushes themselves. This battle left an indelible lesson. In the right hands, even the most ordinary landscape features could become extraordinary weapons. While castles and rivers dominated military textbooks, Pate reminded commanders that warfare's true masters were those who could see potential in every thorn bush and ditch. And as the 100 Years' War entered its final chapters, both sides would scour battlefields not just for high ground, but for any scrap of land that could tilt the odds. When Henry V set his sights on Harfleur in 1415, most commanders would have seen those looming coastal cliffs as a nightmare, sheer walls of rock that seemed to dare any army to approach. But where others saw obstacles, Henry saw opportunity. Those cliffs didn't just protect the town, they became his unwitting allies, shaping the entire siege into a brutal waiting game where geography did half the fighting. The brilliance of his strategy lay in forcing the defenders to play by the land's rules. With the sea at their backs and cliffs guarding the flanks, the French had only a handful of viable routes to resupply or reinforce. Henry didn't need to surround the entire town, just choke those narrow approaches. His archers and siege engines took positions where the cliffs funneled enemy movements into predictable paths, turning the natural terrain into a kill zone. Every shipment of food, every messenger trying to slip through, had to run a gauntlet of English steel. But the real masterstroke was psychological. Those same cliffs that made Harfleur seem impregnable became its prison. Cut off from escape or relief, the defenders watched their supplies dwindle while dysentery ravaged their ranks. The steep drops that once offered protection now magnified their isolation, as Henry's forces controlled the high ground overlooking the town. Even the echoes off the cliff faces played tricks, making English siege engines sound closer than they were, fraying nerves with every thunderous impact. What made Harfleur extraordinary wasn't just the siege tactics, but how completely the cliffs dictated the battle's rhythm. Unlike open plains where armies could maneuver freely, here every move had to account for the crushing weight of geography. When the town finally fell after months of starvation and disease, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was proof that even the mightiest defenses could backfire if a clever commander turned nature's gifts against their owners. This siege revealed a harsh truth of medieval warfare. Terrain didn't take sides. Those cliffs had stood for millennia, indifferent to kings and kingdoms. Victory went not to whoever owned the land, but to whoever understood it best. And as the war dragged on, both sides would learn that sometimes the most formidable fortress wasn't made of stone. It was the earth itself, waiting for the right mind to wield it. Winter at Rouen in 1418 should have brought a respite from war, the kind of bitter cold that made men huddle by fires rather than march under banners. But as the Seine froze solid and the moats around the city turned to glassy sheets, the English saw not an obstacle but an invitation. Those ice-choked waterways, designed to keep attackers at bay, became nature's own drawbridges for a siege unlike any other. The defenders had every reason to feel secure. Thick walls stood firm, supplies were stockpiled, and the moats, normally impassable without boats, stretched like jagged teeth around Rouen's perimeter. But they hadn't accounted for the creeping frost. As temperatures plummeted, the ice thickened until it could bear not just the weight of men, but siege towers and catapults dragged across its surface under cover of darkness. The very element meant to protect Rouen now betrayed it, offering the English a silent, unstoppable approach. Timing was everything. Attacks came in the dead of night when the ice was hardest and sentries least alert. Sappers could suddenly appear at the base of walls without the splash of oars or creak of wooden bridges to warn the guards. The frozen moat did more than provide access, it erased sound, letting attackers close the distance before alarms could be raised. Even the psychological impact worked in the invaders' favor. Defenders peering into the darkness saw only their own breath, not the shadows gliding toward them on the ice. What made this tactic revolutionary wasn't just its boldness, but how it exploited seasonal changes as strategic opportunities. Most medieval armies treated winter as downtime, a pause in campaigning. The English turned it into a weapon. They didn't just endure the cold, they harnessed it, letting the frozen landscape do what battering rams could not. By dawn, siege engines would loom where only ice had been hours before, their sudden presence demoralizing defenders who thought themselves untouchable until spring. The siege dragged on for months, but those first icy assaults cracked Rouen's confidence as surely as the frost split stone. It proved that in warfare, there were no true pauses, only changing landscapes begging to be weaponized. And when the city finally fell, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was a lesson in how the cleverest commanders didn't fight against the seasons, but let them march in the vanguard. By the summer of 1453, the 100 Years' War had become a grim chess match where every move carried the weight of history, and at Castellan, the French turned a simple vineyard into their most cunning gambit yet. Those orderly rows of grapevines, painstakingly cultivated over generations, suddenly became something far deadlier. nature's own labyrinth designed to baffle and bleed the English army. What appeared to be peaceful agricultural land concealed a trap where every twisting path led straight into the jaws of French cannons. The genius of this defense lay in its perfect marriage of rural practicality and military deception. Unlike forests or marshes that naturally impeded movement, these vineyards had been shaped by human hands, their rows spaced just wide enough to tempt soldiers forward, yet narrow enough to prevent orderly formations. As the English advanced, their ranks fractured, men stumbling between the woody vines that clutched at their legs like skeletal fingers. What should have been a straightforward charge dissolved into chaos as companies lost sight of one another, their cohesion shattered by the very landscape they dismissed as harmless. French gunners, positioned on slight rises between the vine rows, didn't even need precise aim. They simply waited for the English to funnel themselves into kill zones where the tangled growth left no room to dodge or retreat. The vines did more than slow the advance. They magnified every cannon's impact as the tight confines turned each blast into a storm of shrapnel and splintered wood. Soldiers who avoided direct hits still faced a nightmare of tripping on roots or impaling themselves on the very stakes meant to support grape clusters. What made Castellan revolutionary wasn't just the victory, but how completely it redefined the relationship between agriculture and warfare. These weren't makeshift obstacles. They were living, legally protected features of the landscape that no commander would normally consider destroying. The French exploited that psychological blind spot perfectly, knowing their enemies would hesitate to hack through valuable private property even as it doomed them. By the time the English realized the vineyards were death traps, their retreat routes were already choked with fallen comrades and trampled vines. The battle's aftermath marked more than just the war's end. It proved that in the right hands, even the most peaceful human alterations to the land could become instruments of devastation. Future generals would study Castellan not for its cannons or cavalry, but for its brutal lesson. Sometimes the deadliest terrain isn't wilderness at all, but the orderly rows of a farmer's field, waiting for war to give them new purpose. And so the 100 Years' War concluded not with a clash of shining armies on open plains, but with vines and grapes bearing witness to one last masterpiece of terrain warfare, where the land didn't just influence the battle, but became its architect. When the English fleet approached Sluys in 1340, the French admirals must have felt confident. Their ships outnumbered the invaders nearly 2 to 1, with towering castles of wood that dominated the horizon. But beneath those waves lay an invisible weapon the French hadn't accounted for, shifting sandbars that would transform the entire battle into a slaughterhouse of geography. The English didn't just sail into that narrow estuary, they lured their enemies onto nature's own killing floor. Those sandbars weren't accidents of nature, they were tactical tools meticulously exploited. English captains, many of them fishermen who'd navigated these waters for generations, knew exactly where the seafloor rose abruptly, where deep channels twisted like secret passageways between shallow graves. As the French advanced, their heavier vessels designed for open water found themselves suddenly stranded, hulls grinding against sand as the tide receded. What should have been a battle of broadsides became a grotesque tableau of immobilized ships, their crews frantically trying to free themselves while English archers rained fire from lighter boats that danced just beyond the shallows. The real genius lay in timing the attack with the tides. The English didn't just use the sandbars, they weaponized the very rhythm of the sea itself. By engaging as the water began to ebb, they ensured the French would be stuck fast within hours, their ships tilting helplessly as the waves abandoned them. Meanwhile, England's smaller vessels could still maneuver through channels only locals knew, attacking from angles the French couldn't counter. Even the wind played its part, blowing smoke from fire arrows directly into the stranded ship's sails, blinding defenders as flames licked at tar-coated rigging. What made Sly's revolutionary wasn't just the victory, but how thoroughly it redefined naval warfare. For centuries, battles at sea had been contests of brute strength, bigger ships, taller castles, more men. Here, the English proved that knowledge of the environment could trump sheer power. Those sandbars didn't care which fleet flew the royal banners. They served whoever understood their secrets. By day's end, the French fleet wasn't just defeated, it was annihilated, its corpses so thick in the water that chroniclers claimed a man could walk across the wreckage without wetting his boots. This battle left an indelible lesson. Mastery of terrain wasn't limited to land. Oceans had their own battlefields, their own killing zones, and the admirals who could read the waves like maps would always outfight those who merely counted ships. As the war dragged on, both sides would learn that sometimes the deadliest weapon wasn't made of wood or iron, but of sand and tide, waiting for the right commander to unleash them. The river at Bergerac should have been a French stronghold, its wide currents and sturdy bridges offering safe passage for their massive army. But in 1345, the English turned this watery highway into a death trap with one ruthless decision. They demolished every crossing except one. What remained wasn't just a bridge, it became the narrow stage for a masterclass in terrain warfare, where geography reduced thousands to mere targets. Breaking bridges seems simple enough, but the brilliance lay in execution. The English didn't just collapse any random span, they preserved the weakest crossing, a rickety wooden structure barely wide enough for 4 men abreast. This was no accident. By leaving one fragile link intact, they dictated exactly where the French would attack, herding them into a bottleneck where numerical superiority became irrelevant. The riverbanks, already steep and slippery from autumn rains, funneled the advancing troops into a chaotic scrum, their armor and weapons clattering as they jostled for space. Timing amplified the disaster. English longbowmen, positioned on elevated ground overlooking the bridge, waited until the French vanguard was midway across before unleashing their volleys. Trapped on the swaying planks with nowhere to retreat, knights stumbled into one another as arrows found gaps in visors and seams in armor. The river below, once a natural barrier, now became a grave for those who plunged into its currents weighed down by steel. Even the bridge's groaning timbers played their part, the sound of cracking wood heightening panic as men realized they'd been lured into a slaughterhouse. But the true innovation wasn't destruction, it was control. By choosing which bridge survived, the English transformed the landscape from a passive obstacle into an active participant. The French couldn't flank or disperse, they had to engage on terms written by the terrain itself. Every advantage their numbers might have offered on open ground evaporated in that cramped, crumbling corridor. Bergerac proved a chilling lesson. In warfare, sometimes the most devastating tactic isn't confronting your enemy, it's forcing them to confront the land on your terms. And as the 100 Years' War raged on, both sides would learn that rivers didn't just separate armies, they could drown them. Dawn at Formigny in April 1450 should have favored the English, their longbowmen famously deadly in open daylight. But as the first French scouts crept forward, they didn't see a disadvantage in the thick morning fog rolling in from the coast. They saw an opportunity to rewrite the rules of engagement. That mist, which might have scattered lesser armies, became the perfect smokescreen for one of the most audacious ambushes of the war. The French commanders didn't just wait for the fog to lift like their enemies. They timed their advance to exploit every shifting patch of haze, moving troops along shallow depressions in the land where visibility was worst. English sentries, straining to peer through the gloom, heard only muffled footsteps and the occasional clink of armor, too late to warn their comrades. By the time the sun began burning through the mist, French crossbowmen were already in position, their bolts finding targets before the English could form their famed defensive stakes. What made this tactic so devastating was how it weaponized uncertainty. The fog didn't just hide the French approach, it fragmented the English response. Orders shouted in the mist were misinterpreted, companies stumbled into each other, and the longbowmen, usually disciplined killers at range, found themselves fighting blind in a chaotic melee. Even the terrain played into the trap. Low-lying marshy ground amplified the fog's density near the English lines, while the French attacked from slightly higher, drier ground where the air cleared first. But the real stroke of genius was psychological. The English, accustomed to controlling battles with their superior archery, suddenly faced an enemy that seemed to materialize from nowhere. That primal fear of the unseen shattered their cohesion far faster than any cavalry charge. By midday, what began as a routine march had become a rout, proving that in warfare, sometimes the most lethal terrain isn't the ground beneath your feet, but the very air you breathe. Formigny's legacy endures as a masterclass in environmental opportunism. Future generals would study it not for grand maneuvers or technological leaps, but for its simple, brutal lesson. The best battlefield advantages aren't always seized. Sometimes they drift in on the wind, waiting for the cunning to claim them. The battlefield at Auray in 1364 seemed like any other patch of contested ground until Breton commanders noticed that jagged ravine slicing through the landscape. What others might have dismissed as an inconvenience became their secret weapon, turning geography into an unbreakable shield. By anchoring their right flank against that steep-sided gully, they didn't just shorten their defensive line, they rewrote the entire calculus of the battle. Ravines in medieval warfare were more than just ditches, they were force multipliers. The one at Auray plunged deep enough to break a charging horse's legs, its slopes too sheer for armored men to climb under fire. Breton archers positioned along the rim could rain arrows diagonally into any force foolish enough to attempt the crossing, while their own infantry remained safely out of reach. This single natural feature effectively erased a third of the battlefield, allowing the defenders to concentrate every spare soldier on the remaining fronts. But the real brilliance lay in how the Bretons exploited the ravine's psychological impact. Opposing commanders, seeing that impassable gap, instinctively avoided it, just as planned. Their troop movements became predictable, funneled into kill zones where Breton crossbowmen waited. Even the ravine's acoustics played a role. The echoes of clashing steel and dying men bouncing off its walls amplified the chaos, unnerving attackers who couldn't see the source of the sounds. What made Auray revolutionary wasn't just the tactical advantage, but how effortlessly nature did the defenders' work. While castles required years to build and moats needed digging, this ravine had been waiting centuries for someone to recognize its military potential. The Bretons didn't just use the land, they listened to it, understanding that sometimes the best fortifications weren't built by human hands, but carved by time itself. This battle proved that in warfare, the shrewdest commanders didn't just adapt to terrain, they let it dictate their enemies' mistakes. That ravine didn't just protect a flank, it became a silent general, shaping the battle more decisively than any shouted order. And as the 100 Years' War raged on, both sides would learn that the most formidable defenses often came not from engineers, but from the earth's own restless shaping. The marshes near Bordeaux looked like every other patch of soggy ground in Anjou until the Scottish forces fighting for France saw their hidden potential. When English scouts reported enemy troops fleeing into those wetlands in March 1421, it seemed like a stroke of luck, but that carefully staged retreat masked one of the war's most brilliant terrain traps, where the land itself would do what swords could not. What made this ruse so effective was its cruel simplicity. The Scots knew English men-at-arms would pursue without hesitation, their confidence in heavy armor outweighing any concern for the ground beneath them. But as the first knights charged into the reeds, their steel-clad feet sank deeper with every step. The harder they struggled forward, the more the swamp swallowed them, waist-deep muck neutralizing their greatest advantage. Meanwhile, lightly equipped Scottish spearmen moved effortlessly across hidden firm paths they'd mapped in advance, their wool gambesons staying buoyant while English plate mail dragged men under. The real stroke of genius came in the trap's timing. The Scots waited until high tide, when groundwater made the marshes doubly treacherous. What might have been merely muddy at dawn became waist-deep by midday, with incoming water silently rising around immobilized knights. English archers, usually lethal at range, found their bowstrings slackening in the damp air, while Scottish archers fired from stable platforms of bundled reeds. Every element, the water, the vegetation, even the angle of the sun glinting off the bog pools, had been calculated to maximize chaos. This wasn't just a victory of arms, it was a masterclass in environmental psychology. The Scots understood that terrain could break an army's spirit long before it broke their bodies. As English knights floundered like overturned turtles, their carefully maintained discipline dissolved into panic. The very armor that symbolized their elite status became their executioner, its weight pulling them under while Scottish spearmen picked their targets at leisure. Bourget's legacy endures not just as a battle, but as a dark poem of medieval warfare where the land didn't just kill, it humiliated. Future commanders would study its lesson. Sometimes the most devastating terrain isn't what stops an army in its tracks, but what lets it charge forward just far enough to realize it's already lost. Orleans in 1428 should have been an English stronghold, its walls surrounded, its gates blocked, its defenders starving. But the city's greatest defense wasn't its crumbling fortifications. It was the tangled web of streets and alleys that Joan of Arc's forces turned into a hunter's paradise. Those narrow lanes, designed for merchants and townsfolk, became a nightmare for English soldiers who quickly learned that in urban warfare, every shadow could hide a blade, every doorway an ambush. The French didn't just defend Orleans, they weaponized its very layout. While the English expected traditional siege warfare with clear battle lines, Joan's commanders exploited the city's irregular design. Streets twisted unexpectedly, dead-ending into courtyards where crossbowmen waited on rooftops. Alleyways barely wide enough for two men abreast funneled armored knights into kill zones where polearms could strike from upper windows. Even the overhanging timbered houses became tools of war, their jutting beams perfect for dropping rocks or boiling water onto passing troops below. Timing was everything. Attacks came at dusk when the setting sun blinded English sentries peering into the maze, or at dawn when fog pooled in the lowest streets, masking French movements. Small bands of militia, familiar with every shortcut and cellar passage, could strike suddenly and vanish before reinforcements arrived. The English, trained for open battles, found their heavy armor a liability in these cramped spaces, too cumbersome to maneuver, too loud to conceal their approach. Meanwhile, Joan's forces traveled light, their knowledge of the terrain letting them appear and disappear like ghosts. The real stroke of genius lay in psychology. By turning the city itself into an active combatant, the French shattered the English sense of security. Soldiers who'd marched confidently through conquered towns now hesitated at every intersection, flinched at every open window. The very streets they'd expected to parade through as victors became a labyrinth where they were the prey. Even the civilians played their part, barricading alleys, hiding supplies, and spreading misinformation to lure patrols into traps. This urban warfare reached its climax during the night assaults on the English bastilles. Instead of frontal attacks, French troops snaked through forgotten drainage tunnels and over garden walls, emerging inside fortified positions that were supposedly secure. The besiegers, who'd planned for siege towers and battering rams, found themselves fighting in pitch-black stables and back kitchens, their carefully prepared defenses rendered useless by enemies who knew the city's bones better than its architects. Orleans proved that terrain warfare wasn't limited to forests and fields sometimes. The deadliest landscapes were the ones humans built themselves. The city didn't just shelter its defenders, it fought alongside them, its every cobblestone and gutter reshaped into weapons. And when the siege finally broke, it wasn't just a military victory. It was a testament to how creativity could transform even the most familiar ground into a battlefield where the land itself chose the winner. Mont Saint-Michel wasn't just an abbey, it was a fortress sculpted by the sea itself. When English forces laid siege in 1423, they quickly discovered that the real defenders weren't just the monks and soldiers inside, but the relentless tides and shifting sands surrounding the island. Those towering dunes, shaped by centuries of coastal winds, became nature's own ramparts, while the tidal flats transformed into a liquid moat that appeared and vanished with the precision of a celestial clock. The English commanders, accustomed to scaling castle walls, found themselves battling something far more unpredictable: the very rhythm of the ocean. At low tide, their siege engines could theoretically advance across the exposed seabed, but the terrain concealed its treachery beneath a thin crust of sand. Wheels sank into quicks, and like patches, men stumbled into hidden channels, and by the time they'd struggled halfway, the tide would come roaring back with terrifying speed, forcing a frantic retreat. The French didn't need to fire a single arrow to repel these assaults. The sea did their work for them, drowning supplies, scattering formations, and leaving attackers stranded on shrinking islands of sand. But the dunes held even deadlier secrets. French defenders had spent years memorizing the safe paths through this ever-changing landscape, while English troops blundered into traps invisible to the untrained eye. What looked like solid ground might collapse under the weight of armor, and patches of innocent-looking seaweed often marked sinkholes deep enough to swallow a horse. The abbey's archers, positioned on high walls, picked off invaders slowed by the terrain with cruel efficiency, their arrows arcing down like seabirds diving for prey. The real stroke of genius lay in timing. The French launched counterattacks exclusively during the turning tides, when the English were most disoriented by the shifting waters. As defenders streamed out across ground they knew would remain firm, attackers found themselves caught between advancing foes and the incoming sea, their retreat routes vanishing beneath the waves. Even the dunes played psychological warfare, their shapes altering subtly with each tide, making prior reconnaissance useless and heightening the invaders' sense of futility. Mont Saint-Michel's defense proved that the strongest fortifications weren't always made of stone. Here, the alliance of sand and tide created a dynamic barrier. No human engineer could replicate one that rebuilt itself twice daily, erased supply lines, and turned time itself into a weapon. The English eventually abandoned the siege, not for lack of courage, but because they'd finally grasped the truth. Some castles aren't meant to be stormed, only admired from a distance, as the sea whispers its eternal refusal. This stalemate left an indelible lesson in medieval warfare, that the cleverest commanders didn't just build walls, but learned to listen to the land's own voice. And as the 100 Years' War wore on, both sides would remember that sometimes the most impregnable fortress wasn't a thing of mortar and timber, but a dance of wind, water, and will. The garrison at La Roche-Darian felt secure behind its walls in 1347 until the wind shifted, carrying not just the scent of pine, but the acrid sting of smoke. The English, frustrated by the fortress's stubborn defenses, didn't just attack the stronghold, they turned the surrounding forest into a weapon. Those towering oaks and pines, once a source of timber and game, became fuel for one of the most terrifying environmental tactics of the war. Fire wasn't new to medieval warfare, but the scale and precision of this assault rewrote the rules. English troops didn't haphazardly torch the woods, they carefully selected stands of resin-rich evergreens that would burn hottest and smokiest, then waited for the wind to blow directly toward the fortress. The resulting inferno did more than scorch the earth. It created a rolling wall of smoke so dense that sentries atop the ramparts couldn't see their own hands, let alone approaching enemies. Archers, normally lethal from the walls, fired blindly into the choking haze while English siege engines advanced unseen. The real cruelty lay in the smoke's unpredictability. One moment, defenders would gasp for air in a momentary clearing. The next, another wave would roll in, stinging eyes and throats, reducing seasoned soldiers to stumbling, vomiting wrecks. The French couldn't even retreat effectively. Their own gates became death traps as visibility dropped to zero and panicked men trampled each other in the dark. Meanwhile, English attackers wore damp cloths over their faces, having studied the terrain to approach along shallow ravines where the smoke was thinner. What made La Roche-Darian revolutionary wasn't just the fire, it was the exploitation of microclimates. The English commanders noted how morning breezes funneled through specific valleys, carrying smoke like a directed weapon. They timed their assault to coincide with the garrison's watering routines, when the castle's wells would be busiest and chaos hardest to contain. Even the forest's natural clearings played a role, acting as fire breaks that prevented the blaze from spreading backward toward English positions. This battle proved terrain warfare could be as much about chemistry as geography. The very air became hostile, turning a defensive stronghold into a suffocating prison. When the gates finally fell, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was a grim lesson in how the land could be reshaped into something far more dangerous than mere obstacles. Future commanders would study La Roche-Darian not for its sieges or swords, but for its chilling revelation. Sometimes the deadliest terrain isn't the ground you stand on, but the sky above it. Cherbourg's harbor in 1450 should have been a death sentence for the French defenders. Surrounded by English forces on the mainland, their position seemed hopeless. But one feature changed everything. A tiny island just offshore, barely large enough for a garrison, yet perfectly positioned to become the ultimate thorn in the besiegers' side. This wasn't just a refuge, it was a springboard for relentless hit-and-run raids that turned isolation into a weapon. The island's genius lay in its limitations. Too small for the English to bother occupying, yet just close enough to the mainland for nighttime raids, it became an unsinkable warship anchored in the harbor. French commanders didn't just hide there, they exploited the tides with precision, launching skiffs under cover of darkness when the water masked their oars' splashes. By dawn, they'd vanish back across the channel, leaving behind scorched supply depots and panicked sentries. The English couldn't retaliate effectively. Their heavy barges were useless in the island's shallow approaches, and every attempted landing faced withering fire from defenders who knew every rock and crevice. But the real brilliance was psychological. That speck of land, visible yet untouchable, became a constant taunt to the besiegers. English troops never knew when the next raid would come. The island's isolation meant the French could strike without warning, then disappear into the morning mist. Supply lines became nightmares as wagons had to detour miles inland to avoid coastal ambushes. Even the island's natural wildlife played a role. Seabirds startled by French movements would take flight, unintentionally signaling raids, until defenders learned to move at low tide when the birds slept, turning silence itself into a tactical advantage. What made Cherbourg extraordinary wasn't just the raids, but how the French transformed geographical constraints into opportunities. Most commanders would see a tiny island as a prison. These defenders saw it as a pivot point. By controlling that sliver of land, they dictated the tempo of the entire siege, forcing the English to waste resources guarding against attacks that might come from any direction. The island didn't just shelter the French, it amplified them, proving that in warfare, sometimes the smallest terrain features cast the longest shadows. This standoff revealed a counterintuitive truth. Isolation could be liberating. Cut off from retreat, the French fought with the desperation of men who had nothing to lose, while the English, for all their numbers, were the ones who felt surrounded. And as the siege dragged on, it became clear that some strongholds aren't measured in acres, but in the sheer audacity of those who defend them. The river at Meung-Surl, had been an English lifeline for months, their supply boats gliding undisturbed beneath the high cliffs, carrying everything from salted beef to fresh arrows. But in June 1429, those towering limestone walls stopped being scenery and became the stage for one of Joan of Arc's most ruthless ambushes. Her forces didn't just occupy the cliffs, they transformed them into a natural artillery platform, where gravity did as much damage as the arrows themselves. What made this tactic so devastating was its simplicity. The English, accustomed to glancing up at those cliffs as mere landscape, never considered they might rain death. Joan's archers positioned themselves on narrow ledges, their longbows angled downward so each shot gained terrifying momentum from the sheer drop. Arrows that might glance off armor on level ground now punched straight through helmets and shoulder plates, their force multiplied by the fall. The river's current compounded the chaos. Boats couldn't veer away without risking capsizing, leaving them drifting helplessly through the kill zone while their crews frantically raised shields overhead like turtle shells. But the real stroke of genius was in the ambush's timing. Joan's scouts had studied the English supply schedules, waiting for a convoy heavy with siege equipment, slow-moving barges laden with trebuchet parts and iron ingots. As the lead boat rounded the bend, French archers let loose a synchronized volley that turned the river into a pincushion. The cliff face acted as a natural echo chamber, amplifying the screams of wounded men and the splintering of wood until the sound alone became a weapon, shattering English morale before the second volley even landed. Elevation wasn't the only terrain feature exploited here. The overhanging vegetation concealed the archers until the last moment, while the river's curve forced boats to slow down, making them perfect targets. Even the afternoon sun played its part, blinding English lookouts, scanning the cliffs while illuminating the boats below like ducks in a shooting gallery. Within minutes, what had been a routine supply run became a floating graveyard, the current carrying the wreckage downstream as a warning to other English garrisons. This ambush proved that in warfare, the most mundane routes could become death traps in the right hands. Joan didn't just use the cliffs, she weaponized perspective itself, forcing the English to confront a brutal truth. The high ground wasn't just an advantage. It was dominion, and as the wreckage of Meung-Surl smoldered on the banks, it was clear that in this war, even the rocks had chosen sides. The golden wheat fields around Jajo shimmered innocently under the June sun in 1429, until they erupted with steel and fury. What the English garrison assumed was just another stretch of farmland became Joan of Arc's most audacious camouflage, proving that in the hands of a cunning commander, even harvest-ready crops could be drafted into service. The French didn't just hide in those shoulder-high stalks, they turned the entire landscape into a living trap where nature's bounty masked an approaching storm. Timing was everything. Joan's forces advanced at dawn when the low angle of the sun made the swaying wheat glow like molten gold, blinding sentries scanning the horizon. The stalks themselves muffled the sound of marching men and clinking armor, while the morning breeze created enough natural movement to disguise the tremors of an entire army inching forward. By the time English lookouts spotted the tips of lances bobbing above the grain, the French vanguard was already close enough to see the whites of their enemies' widening eyes. The wheat didn't just conceal, it dictated the battle's shape. Unlike forests or ditches that fragmented formations, these carefully cultivated rows channeled the French charge into disciplined lines, their advance hidden until the last possible moment. English longbowmen, deprived of their usual early warning, barely had time to knock arrows before armored knights burst from the sea of gold. Even the trampled stalks underfoot became weapons, tangling the legs of retreating soldiers while the French pursued effortlessly along paths they'd covertly flattened in advance. What made Jajo revolutionary wasn't just the ambush, but how thoroughly it exploited agricultural rhythms. The French had waited until the wheat reached its maximum height, tall enough to hide a mounted knight, yet dry enough to rustle without revealing movement. They'd studied the harvest schedule too, striking when the fields were at their most vulnerable and valuable. The English, seeing peasants still working nearby, assumed the area secure, never suspecting those same farmers were Joan's scouts, measuring wind direction and reporting guard rotations under the guise of checking crop readiness. This battle redefined the very meaning of cover. No longer were armies limited to forests or fog. Now, any patch of cultivated land could conceal an advancing force. The wheat field at Jajo proved that in warfare, sometimes the most effective weapons weren't forged in armories, but sown by farmers and ripened under the sun, waiting for the right moment to reveal their deadly purpose. Most fortresses relied on towering walls and deep moats, but Chinon's real strength lay beneath the cobblestones, in a labyrinth of caves carved by ancient rivers. When the English laid siege in 1429, they expected to starve the defenders into submission. What they didn't realize was that the castle's lifeline ran underground, where messengers slipped through darkness like ghosts, and barrels of grain appeared as if by magic. These weren't just tunnels, they were a secret highway that turned geology into a wartime asset. The cave's brilliance lay in their unpredictability. Unlike man-made passageways with straight corridors, these natural formations twisted unexpectedly, their ceilings jagged with stalactites that made pursuit impossible for armored soldiers. French scouts, barefoot to move silently, could navigate the total darkness by memory, feeling for specific rock formations as guideposts. At strategic points, narrow chimneys opened to the surface, disguised as natural sinkholes or rabbit warrens, allowing supplies to be lowered under cover of darkness. Even the cave's acoustics played tricks. Whispers carried oddly around bends, making English search parties chasing echoes while messengers escaped through side passages. What made Chinon's underground network revolutionary wasn't just concealment, it was sustainability. While other sieges ended when wells ran dry, Chinon's caves tapped into underground springs, their cool depths preserving food far longer than surface storerooms. The French didn't just endure the siege, they thrived, holding banquets in cavern chambers to taunt the English, the smell of roasting meat drifting up through fissures to torment hungry besiegers. Meanwhile, coded messages traveled safely beneath enemy lines, written on thin parchment that could be swallowed if capture seemed imminent. The psychological toll on the English was devastating. No matter how tightly they encircled the castle, they could never silence the mocking trumpet blasts that echoed from the hillsides, French musicians playing deep in the caves, their sound amplified by the stone corridors. Rumors spread of an underground city where defenders lived in luxury, fed by secret farms in sunlit caverns. The truth was simpler yet more ingenious. Chinon's commanders had turned the very bones of the earth into their strongest ally, proving that in warfare, sometimes the deepest advantages lie where sunlight never reaches. This subterranean resistance redefined medieval siegecraft. Future generals would learn that controlling land meant more than holding fields and forests. It required mastery of the unseen world beneath. Chinon's caves didn't just shelter the defenders, they hollowed out the besiegers' confidence, one echoing footfall in the dark at a time. The tidal flats near Sandwich looked like any other stretch of coastline until the French raiders turned the moon's pull into a tactical blueprint. In 1457, when English sentries spotted sails on the horizon, they assumed they had hours to prepare, not realizing the attackers had synchronized their assault with the tides themselves. This wasn't just a raid, it was a precision strike choreographed by the sea. French commanders had spent years studying the Kentish coast's peculiar rhythms. Unlike predictable Mediterranean tides, the English Channel's currents surged with erratic intensity, exposing vast mudflats at low tide that became impassable traps for heavy infantry. The raiders timed their landings to perfection, hitting isolated outposts just as the water receded, then vanishing before reinforcements could slog across the newly exposed terrain. Their lightweight longships, designed for shallow drafts, could escape through channels that stranded heavier English vessels, leaving pursuers stuck in the silt like flies in amber. But the real stroke of genius was in the raid's psychological toll. The English never knew which tide would bring death. One moment, the flats would lie empty under the morning sun. The next, French soldiers would materialize as if conjured by the waves striking with the water's retreat. By the time local garrisons mustered a response, the attackers would already be halfway back to Normandy, their ships riding the returning tide like seabirds skimming the surface. Even the mud played its part. Deep, sucking patches hidden beneath thin layers of water slowed pursuers to a crawl, while the raiders wearing flexible leather boots darted across firm paths known only to their Breton pilots. This wasn't just hit-and-run warfare, it was environmental puppetry. The French didn't merely use the tides, they weaponized the very concept of time. English commanders, trained to measure battles in arrows loosed or swords swung, now had to track the moon's phases just to predict when their coasts might bleed. Forts built to withstand sieges stood useless against an enemy that refused to linger, and supply depots burned not because their guards were lax, but because they'd checked the tide tables an hour too late. Sandwich's tidal flats revealed a humbling truth. In coastal warfare, the real high ground wasn't on land at all. It was etched in the sea's eternal dance of advance and retreat. And long after the raiders faded into the mist, their greatest legacy lingered in the whispers of English sentries, forever glancing at the water's edge, wondering if the next receding tide would bear the sand or an army. The winter of 1435 near Gerberoi didn't just blanket the countryside in snow, it handed French commanders the perfect cloak for an ambush. Fresh powder, often seen as a seasonal nuisance that stalled campaigns, became an unlikely ally when the Valois forces realized its transformative power. Those pristine white fields weren't just empty landscapes. They were canvases waiting for an army's footsteps to rewrite the rules of visibility. French scouts had spent days observing English patrol routes, noting how sentries relied on the contrast of dark shapes against snow to spot threats. So when the next storm rolled in, they didn't hunker down, they adapted. Soldiers swapped their usual tabards for bleached linen cloaks, scrubbed the shine from their helmets with ashes, and even muffled their horses' hooves with wrapped cloth. As dawn broke over the freshly fallen snow, the advancing troops became nearly indistinguishable from the drifts around them. English lookouts, straining their eyes against the glare, saw nothing but an unbroken expanse until the first war cries erupted from what had seemed like empty ground. Timing played a cruel trick. The French attacked during that brief window when the morning sun hung low, casting long shadows that disguised the depth and movement of their formations. What looked like harmless ridges of snow suddenly erupted into armored knights, their previously camouflaged lances now glinting as they charged downhill. The English, unprepared for an assault that seemed to materialize from the landscape itself, scrambled to form ranks on ground made treacherous by hidden ice patches. Even the snow's acoustics worked against them. Muffled footsteps masked the French advance until it was too late, while their own shouted orders dissipated uselessly in the thick, damp air. But the real innovation lay in the retreat plan. Knowing fresh snow would betray their escape route with tracks, the French had pre-positioned reserve troops to sweep parallel paths with branches, creating a maze of false trails. By the time English reinforcements arrived, they found a bewildering spiderweb of footprints leading in every direction, while the attackers vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared. This wasn't just winter warfare, it was a magic trick performed with geography, where the land itself conspired to mislead and disorient. Gerberoi's snow tactics revealed a profound shift in medieval military thinking. No longer was terrain just about solid ground. It encompassed every seasonal transformation, every temporary condition that could be weaponized. Future commanders would study this battle not for its weapons or casualties, but for its chilling lesson. Sometimes, the most formidable army isn't the one that stands tall, but the one that knows how to disappear into the world around it. La Charité-sur Loire in 1429 didn't just sit near rivers, it was cradled by them, a fortress where nature's own currents drew the battle lines. Where most commanders saw waterways as obstacles to cross, the French defenders saw something far more valuable, living walls that dictated where and how their enemies could strike. The town's position at the fork of two rivers created a natural triangle of defense, forcing attackers into a deadly funnel where every approach could be anticipated and countered. The brilliance of this setup lay in its simplicity. The converging rivers narrowed the battlefield to a handful of predictable crossing points, each covered by archers positioned on elevated banks. English forces couldn't simply surround the town, they had to divide their strength, stretching thin across multiple fronts while the defenders concentrated their forces at the choke points. Even the river's seasonal behavior played into French hands. Spring meltwaters swelled the currents, making fording impossible, while summer's lower levels exposed treacherous mudflats that bogged down armored knights. The water didn't just defend, it adapted, but the real stroke of genius was psychological. The French didn't just rely on the rivers as barriers, they weaponized their presence. By leaving a single bridge intact, seemingly vulnerable, they lured the English into a trap. Attackers who rushed that narrow span found themselves caught in a kill zone, their formations shattered by crossfire from both banks while the river at their backs cut off retreat. Meanwhile, French skirmishers, familiar with every shallow ford and sandbar, could slip across to harass the English flanks, then vanish back into the reeds like spirits. What made La Charité-sur Loire extraordinary wasn't just the river's defensive value, but how they reshaped the entire rhythm of the siege. The English couldn't camp safely, nighttime raids arrived by boat, silent until French blades flashed in the moonlight. Supply lines became nightmares as wagons had to detour miles upstream to find crossings, leaving them vulnerable to ambush. Even the fish betrayed the besiegers. Defenders netted them by the barrelful, while English troops starved watching the shimmering abundance just beyond their reach. This standoff revealed a truth too often forgotten in medieval warfare. Rivers weren't just lines on a map. They were alive, shifting allies that could drown an army's hopes as easily as its men. And long after the siege lifted, the lesson lingered sometimes. The strongest walls aren't built of stone, but of water and the cunning to wield it. The fields outside Bojancy appeared perfectly suited for a classic cavalry charge, wide, flat, and unobstructed, until French scouts noticed the scattered rocky outcrops jutting from the earth like nature's own caltrops. What English commanders dismissed as minor inconveniences became the linchpin of a devastating defensive strategy in 1429, proving that in medieval warfare, even the smallest terrain features could tip the scales between triumph and slaughter. These weren't mere pebbles littering the battlefield. The weathered limestone formations stood just tall enough to snap a horse's leg at full gallop, their jagged edges hidden by tufts of grass until it was too late. French commanders deliberately anchored their flanks against the largest clusters, compressing the English charge into a narrow corridor where momentum became a liability. Knights who'd spent a lifetime training for open-field combat suddenly found their formations splintering as warhorses shied away from the rocks or stumbled over them, their riders thrown violently into the path of oncoming comrades. Timing played a cruel role. The French waited until dusk to provoke the attack, when the low-angle light camouflaged the outcrops as harmless shadows. As the English cavalry thundered forward, the last rays of sunlight glinting off their lances, the rocks transformed into invisible wrecking balls. The ensuing chaos resembled less a battle than a grisly traffic jam, horses screaming, men pinned beneath fallen steeds, and the rear ranks piling helplessly into the carnage. French crossbowmen, positioned behind the largest boulders, picked off dismounted knights with clinical precision, their bolts finding gaps in armor as victims struggled to rise on uneven footing. But the real genius lay in how the rocks amplified psychological terror. The English didn't just face enemy soldiers, they battled the land itself, every hoof fall potentially their last. The outcrops shattered the illusion of control that heavy cavalry relied upon, turning what should have been a glorious charge into a nightmarish obstacle course. Even the sound of steel horseshoes scraping against limestone became a weapon, the screech echoing across the field to unnerve those still waiting to advance. Bojancy's rocks redefined the meaning of battlefield terrain. No longer were armies limited to forests or rivers for defense now. Every pebble had potential. Future commanders would scrutinize fields not just for elevation or cover, but for the subtle wrinkles that could fracture an army's cohesion. The battle left an indelible lesson. Sometimes the land doesn't need to stop an army dead, just make it stumble at the wrong moment. And in the chaos of war, that moment is all it takes. By the summer of 1453, the 100 Years' War had become a desperate scramble for survival, and in the vineyards outside Bordeaux, French defenders turned the very act of agriculture into a final, devastating stratagem. Those orderly rows of grapevines, meticulously tended for generations, concealed a secret, zigzagging trenches dug just deep enough for a man to crouch unseen, their excavation disguised as routine pruning or soil management. What appeared to be peaceful farmland became a labyrinth of death where the rhythm of harvest gave way to the art of ambush. The genius of this subterranean network lay in its invisibility. Unlike traditional siege works that announced their presence with mounds of displaced earth, these trenches followed the natural contours of the vineyards. Workers dug during the growing season, scattering the excess soil between rows where it blended with the dark loam. By the time English forces approached, the trenches were already camouflaged under a canopy of leaves, their entrances concealed behind thick vine trunks. From above, the landscape betrayed nothing. Only when attackers stepped between the rows would hidden hands reach up to drag them into the shadows, timing transformed these trenches into true instruments of terror. French militiamen learned to strike during the afternoon heat when the sun hung directly overhead, casting deep shadows that masked movement beneath the vines. A column of English soldiers might march past a seemingly empty vineyard, only to realize too late that the rustling leaves weren't stirred by wind, but by dozens of attackers rising silently from the earth. The vines themselves became accomplices, their tangled tendrils snaring weapons and limbs while defenders struck from below with daggers and hooked bills designed to pull armored men off balance. But the real psychological masterstroke was how thoroughly the French exploited the vineyard's dual identity. English commanders hesitated to torch or trample the precious crops, knowing the region's wine trade funded the war effort. This reluctance gave defenders time to expand their trench networks, tunneling beneath entire fields until the very ground beneath their enemies' feet could collapse into a killing pit. Even the harvest cycles played a role. Attacks intensified during the August veyrason when the grapes turned color, their dappled purple clusters providing perfect cover for bloodstains on fallen soldiers. What made Bordeaux's vineyard trenches extraordinary wasn't just their effectiveness, but their symbolism. In this war's dying days, the land itself seemed to rebel against the invaders, twisting peaceful cultivation into violence. The same hands that had once carefully tied grapevines to stakes now strangled supply lines with guerrilla raids. The final battle at Castellon may have ended the conflict, but these hidden trenches proved the war's enduring lesson, that in the right hands, even the most benign landscapes could be drafted into service. Long after the treaties were signed, English veterans would shudder at the memory of vineyards, not for their wine, but for the whispers that had risen from the earth between the rows, heralding a death as silent as the roots beneath their feet. From marshes to mountains, rivers to vineyards, the 100 Years' War rewrote the rules of combat by proving the land itself could be the deadliest weapon of all. These 25 astonishing examples reveal more than just clever tactics. They show how medieval commanders thought in 3 dimensions, seeing hills as fortresses, forests as allies, and even the changing seasons as tools of war. The real lesson here isn't about swords or siege engines, but about perspective. The greatest generals weren't necessarily the strongest or the best equipped. They were the ones who could read a landscape like a battle plan, turning every rock, river bend, and patch of mud into a force multiplier. What's truly remarkable is how many of these strategies still resonate today. Modern militaries study Agincourt's mud and Crécy's slopes, while survival experts analyze how Joan of Arc used fog and farmland. The principles remain timeless. Elevation controls sightlines, choke points neutralize numbers, and the element of surprise often lies hidden in plain sight. These medieval commanders didn't have satellites or drones, just sharp eyes, local knowledge, and the creativity to see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. But perhaps the most fascinating takeaway is how these battles transformed ordinary places into historical turning points. That nondescript field near Poitiers, a slaughterhouse disguised by trees, the sleepy vineyards of Bordeaux, a maze of trenches waiting to swallow armies whole. History isn't just made in grand castles or famous cities. It's shaped in the quiet moments when someone looks at a stretch of open ground and sees not what it is, but what it could become. So the next time you walk through a forest or cross a river, take a moment to see it through a commander's eyes. Notice where the high ground offers advantage, where the thickets could hide an ambush, how the wind might carry sounds or arrows. Landscapes aren't just backdrops to history, they're active participants waiting for the right mind to unlock their potential. If these ingenious tactics sparked your imagination, pay it forward, smash that like button to help others discover this hidden side of medieval warfare. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's untold strategies and drop your favorite terrain trick in the comments. Was it the frozen moats of Rouen, the wheat fields of Jajo, or something we didn't cover? Let's keep the conversation going. Until our next historical adventure, remember, the earth remembers every battle fought upon it if you know how to.